Okay, so you want to own a scrap metal yard. Put up a fence, buy junk metal for cheap, sell it to a mill or a recycler for more than you've paid. Simple spread business, nothing fancy, cash changes hands. Everybody walks away happy. Here's the strange part. Without meaning to, you could become the final link in a multi-million-dollar organized crime network, and the product moving through your gate might be sitting under someone's car right now. In November 2022, the Department of Justice announced the takedown of a catalytic converter theft ring spanning 21 defendants, 9 states, and $545 million in stolen converters. Every single one of those converters had to pass through a scrap buyer to become cash. That's not an edge case in this industry. That's close to the center of it. By the end of this video, you'll know how a scrapyard actually makes money on the spread between buying and selling metal, why catalytic converter theft turned an entire legitimate industry into one of the most heavily regulated commodity businesses in the country, why the laws designed to stop it keep failing to hold, and what happens at the very top of this industry, where a name most Americans have never heard just got bought out by a trading arm of Toyota. So, how does a scrapyard actually make money on a day-to-day basis? Not from a fixed price, from a spread that moves every single day, sometimes every hour. Scrap breaks into two broad categories: ferrous metal, meaning iron and steel, and non-ferrous metal, meaning copper, aluminum, brass, and anything without iron in it. Non-ferrous is where the real money lives. Copper alone can be worth 10 to 20 times more per pound than ferrous scrap, depending on the day. A yard buys material off the street at a price tied to that day's commodity market, then sells it up the chain to a mill, a smelter, or an export broker at a slightly better price. The industry calls that difference the metal margin, and it is not fixed. It moves with global commodity prices on the London Metal Exchange and COMEX, sometimes swinging 3 to 7% in a single financial quarter for a major operator, which either compresses or expands that spread with zero warning and zero relationship to how well the yard is actually being run. Here's the part that explains why this business feels so different from a normal retail spread operation. You're not actually running a metal business. You're running a leverage bet on global commodity prices, settled every single day at your front gate, with a legal liability standing in line right behind every legitimate seller. That liability has a specific name, and it changed this industry faster than almost any regulatory shift in its history, the catalytic converter. So why did one car part turn an entire legitimate industry into a target? Because the economics of theft became irresistible almost overnight. A single catalytic converter, especially from a hybrid like a Toyota Prius, can contain several $1,000s worth of platinum, palladium, and rhodium, precious metals more valuable per ounce than gold in some periods. A professional thief can cut one out from underneath a parked car in under 90 seconds using a battery-powered saw. Academic researchers who studied 42 months of police data across 8 California cities calculated something called a price elasticity of theft. A 10% rise in precious metal prices produces roughly a 20% rise in catalytic converter theft. Criminal networks in their own field interviews described kicking into overdrive whenever scrap values climbed. This isn't opportunistic crime responding vaguely to hard times. It's a commodity market with its own thieves responding to price signals as precisely as any trader would. Nationally, thefts increased by over 325% between 2019 and 2020 alone. Insurance claims ran into the tens of thousands. And every single stolen converter needed exactly one thing to become money: a scrap buyer willing to take it. Here's the case study that shows why laws alone haven't been able to solve this. Minnesota passed strict legislation in 2023 requiring VIN marking on catalytic converters and mandatory electronic record keeping by every scrap dealer in the state. For a while, it worked. Reported thefts in St. Paul fell dramatically from a 2022 peak of over 2,400 incidents. But by 2025, as precious metal prices rebounded, thefts in that same city jumped from 172 to 504 in a single year, a 193% increase, with the exact same law still fully in force, the exact same record-keeping requirements, the exact same VIN marking programs. Nothing about the legislation had changed, only the price of rhodium had. A deputy police chief in St. Paul put it plainly to local media. The laws are only as good as what people will actually follow and what departments have the capacity to investigate. The damage extends well beyond individual car owners. Between June 2024 and June 2025, the country recorded over 15,500 reported incidents of theft, targeting critical communications, infrastructure alone, nearly double the prior period. One major telecom provider reported copper theft costs reaching $40 million nationwide in a single year. The Department of Energy has noted that repair costs for a single compromised electrical substation, after thieves strip the copper grounding bars, can run anywhere from $500,000 to over $11 million once lost revenue and equipment damage are factored in. Minnesota alone spent over $545,000 in just 2 years replacing stolen copper wiring from streetlights. So, how has all of this reshaped who can legally run a scrapyard at all? Dramatically and unevenly, state by state. More than 30 states now require proof of ownership before a buyer can legally purchase a catalytic converter. Most require photo identification from the seller. Some, including Minnesota and Washington, impose a mandatory 5-day waiting period before any payment can be released, specifically to give theft victims time to file a report before the stolen part gets converted into untraceable cash. A handful of states now require scrap dealers to hold a specific license just to legally buy these parts at all. For a legitimate operator, this means every single converter that comes through the gate now requires documented seller identification, a photograph, a bill of sale, and a paper trail sturdy enough to survive a criminal investigation. A level of compliance overhead that simply didn't exist in this industry a decade ago, layered on top of a business that was already running on razor-thin, commodity-driven margins. Now here's the part that shows what's actually happening at the very top of this industry, while all of this plays out at street level. The recycled metal market is worth roughly $128 billion globally. And unlike a lot of the businesses covered on this channel, it's still surprisingly fragmented. The top 5 players in the entire industry combine for less than half the total market. Nucor Corporation sits at the top, consuming over 20 million metric tons of scrap metal a year to feed its network of electric arc furnace steel mills, giving it more influence over domestic scrap pricing than any other single buyer in the country. Just below that tier sits a name most people outside the industry have never heard: Schnitzer Steel, more recently rebranded as Radius Recycling, a vertically integrated operator running over 50 metals recycling facilities and 50 retail auto parts stores across the country. In 2025, Radius Recycling was acquired entirely by Toyota Tsusho Corporation, the trading and logistics arm of the Toyota Group, the same corporate family whose Prius catalytic converters are among the most stolen car parts in America, now owning one of the country's largest legal channels for recycling the metal underneath its own vehicles. And even at that scale, the thin margin reality of this business didn't disappear. In one recent quarter, Radius generated just $3 million in positive operating cash flow while carrying $454 million in total debt. A company processing millions of tons of metal a year, still living close to the edge of the same commodity price whiplash that determines whether a single location yard makes money or loses it in any given week. So, what does this actually look like at different scales? A single independent scrapyard lives entirely inside that daily spread, with almost no ability to influence it. Their margin depends on buying at a fair local price and selling fast enough up the chain before the market moves against them, while absorbing every new compliance requirement state legislators add in response to the latest theft headline. Proof of ownership checks, ID photographs, waiting periods. None of which they get any say in designing, all of which they have to fund and enforce at their own gate, on pain of losing their license entirely if a stolen part slips through. A vertically integrated giant like Radius or Nucor operates on a completely different axis. They're not just buying and reselling scrap, they're feeding it directly into their own steel mills or export channels, capturing value at multiple stages instead of just the buy-sell spread. which is exactly why Nucor's control over so much scrap volume gives it outsized influence over the price every smaller yard in the country has to buy and sell against. But even at that scale, as Radius's own numbers show, the underlying business is still a commodity business first. $3 million of operating cash flow against $454 million in debt isn't the balance sheet of a company printing easy money. It's the balance sheet of a company that survives the same daily price swings as the smallest yard in America, just with far larger numbers attached and far more machinery standing between the metal and the payday. So, if you do decide to own a scrap metal yard, understand what you're actually buying. You're not buying a simple buy low, sell high business. You're buying a leveraged, unhedged position in global commodity prices that moves every single day, whether you touch it or not. Standing at a gate where a meaningful share of what walks through has a real chance of being stolen. A risk the industry didn't create, but has been forced to build an entire compliance infrastructure around, state by state, law by law, without ever actually solving the underlying economics that make catalytic converter theft profitable in the first place. The metal itself was never really the business. The spread was. And the spread doesn't care whether the last seller in line owned what they sold you.